Okay, so go away, little thing. Um, Political ecology, cultural ecology, ecosystem approach um, are all interesting theories. They all highlight some of the ways in which culture and land are connected. But if you think about them, despite their differences, they all kind of relate to the way in which land affects us on a material level, right? On sort of the level of something like our house going over a cliff, or how do we make sure there's enough pigs to feed us and not screw up our gardens? Things like that, sort of the physical, material, body connections between human cultures and the land, which is a very important thing to focus on. But around the 60s, 70s, to some degree earlier, but especially around the 60s and 70s, a group of scholars started pointing out something that would have been obvious to a lot of indigenous people, but that took social scientists a while to figure out, which is, wait a second, what about ideas, right? The connections between culture and land are not just how we make a living or how we farm or how we hunt, although that's an important part of it. It's also how we think and how we believe, right? I'm not trying to be kumbaya here or something. There's a very real world of discourses and ideas of how we perceive a place that's a big part of what it means to live in a place and a big part of how the land affects the culture and how culture affects the land, right? The ways in which we come to understand the land can have profound effects on how we live our lives and what we do with our cultures. In fact, some have argued that trying to solve the environment from a purely technological or political standpoint has failed. We've solved some problems, but some problems have only gotten worse in the last 50 years since sort of the dawning of the modern environmental movement. And some, such as the anthropologist Les Sponsel, have argued that we need to have a fundamental shift in how we think about nature and our value systems, which, whether you agree with that or not, it's a fact that there is some kind of connection there, right? Of not just how we make a living on the land, but also how does the land affect our ideas, and how do our ideas affect how we relate to the land? So that's where I'm going next. I'm going to read something from Tom Thornton again from that reading. He says, with relationships with place are a matter not just of living and evolving in specific environments, again, that kind of physical side of it, that relationship. He says it's not just a matter of living and evolving in environments, but also of imagining those environments, right? It's not just how we make a living, but it's also how we think about the land. If we really want to understand how culture is tied up with land, part of that is, how do people think about the land that they are on? Which gets us to the idea of placemaking. I've subtitled this "Land is Never Just Land," right? It's not just literally the physical resources you use, but it's what we think about that space and how we come to envision the land that we find ourselves on. So placemaking, then, we're going to start there. There's going to be a few different theories we touch on. We're going to start with the concept of placemaking. If you were to define placemaking, of course, we could say the super obvious, which is why Tommy Lee is giving us a mean glare. We could be super dumb and obvious about it and just say, oh, it's the ways in which we make places, which is like, yeah, sure. I mean, placemaking is one of those nice terms where the definition is in the term itself. But we can go a little bit deeper than that, and we should go a little bit deeper than that. So let's talk about the distinction between space and place. This gets a little bit ivory tower and abstract, but what's ironic about it is that although this might seem very ivory tower and abstract and weird intellectual navel gazing, the kind of stuff that my dad would just like laugh at when I brought home from college, I found it to actually be incredibly practical if you do work, for example, in the National Park Service or in the Forest Service or working with tribal communities, because this idea of space versus place helps us to understand what it means for people to connect to land. And that can give us a big insight into why, for example, people chose to, despite big economic losses to themselves, chose to protest the Dakota Access Pipeline, right? Even when they were being thrown in jail, people chose to do it. You can't understand that purely by thinking in terms of sort of how people make a living on the land, especially as a lot of people have been forced to not live on the land anymore by being confined to small reservations. Instead, you have to think about, what does the land mean symbolically, right? So this stuff might seem, again, abstract, fuzzy, sort of ivory tower nonsense that professors write about and that doesn't really matter in the real world. But I have found it to be quite the opposite for those of us who work on environmental issues. When we ignore the connections of space and place and meanings to land, we do so at our own peril, right? Federal agencies often get huge pushback, and sometimes perhaps justifiably so, when they ignore what places mean to people, right? And get too focused only on the physical. Oh, we've got this great way to use this land that's going to satisfy, the 3 different user groups. But when they forget to consider what the place means to people symbolically, find themselves in a heap of trouble. And sometimes find themselves arguably violating things like religious freedom for Native peoples. And so, far from being some fuzzy ivory tower idea, this stuff's very practical. So come with me, even if it gets a little weird and theoretical for a minute. There was a quote that's attributed originally to a Greek writer, I guess philosopher, by the name of Archytas. But then it was quoted by Simplicitus, which is why we have it today. But then it was quoted by Edward Casey, who was a philosopher that did a lot of famous work on space and placemaking and developed some of those ideas. And then that now is being quoted by me, Adam Dunstan, on this PowerPoint slide. And ironically enough, there's now going to be a 5th degree of Kevin Bacon. I mean, a 5th degree of Archytas, because you might very well quote this in your term paper. So we now have 5 layers of quoting, right? It's turtles all the way down on this one. But anyways, the original quote is, "Perhaps place is the first of all things." What that means. So early Greek philosophy, which to some degree sort of the European Enlightenment was kind of building off of, as was the earlier sort of Islamic Enlightenment, Greek philosophy kind of had this idea, and an idea that we still see in fields like physics and sort of certain kinds of philosophy, that if we're to understand reality, we really need to start with time and space, right? Those 2 sort of fundamental axes of existence. There's a reason that when people like Stephen Hawking are trying to describe a theory of everything, a lot of that comes down to trying to explain space-time, right? We see space and time as these sort of fundamental aspects of reality that we're trying to understand what those are. But as Archytas points out, and as Edward Casey later expanded on a lot, several thousand years later, human beings don't really experience the world as abstract space. We can do these sort of logical mind games of like sort of a space as a point on a grid of abstract space, and what does that mean mathematically? But we don't experience the world as a mathematical equation. We don't experience space as this sort of abstract scientific concept. We experience it instead as places, right? We experience the world as the forest right by my house growing up that I used to always build forts in. We experience place as my grandpa's farm that I visited as a kid, that it gave me some of my earliest memories that weren't my organ memories. We experience place as I was talking to a bunch of river guides the other day, right? As the memories that we have attached to specific fishing holes. And the joys that we've had doing river guiding in those areas and fishing for our own subsistence in those areas. We don't experience the world as abstract space. We experience it as place, right? As meaningful locations that are embedded deeply in our psyche. There's a lot of good research to show that, especially when we're developing as youth and adolescents, but also throughout our entire life, places imprint themselves deeply on our psychology. They also imprint themselves deeply on our societies, right? And they come to mean something much deeper than just what the physical box of space itself would suggest. So again, the idea of space, place, and placemaking. I have here a picture from the TV show Yellowstone. I don't know if people watch that. My wife watches it, and so I occasionally catch an episode here and there. As usual, Kevin Costner is an excellent episode. I was happy to see that they had a lot of that they had a pretty good amount of Native actors, and that they have dealt with the tribal politics part of that story, I would say, better than some movies do. I think it shows that they actually consulted with Native groups while writing the scripts. I'm not going to say it's perfect, but I think Yellowstone does quite a few things right in terms of showing some of the complexities of politics in that part of the world, land politics, obviously in a fictionalized way to sort of highly dramatize it, but some of the underlying tensions that are there between settler groups, Native groups, outside developers, all of that. Anyways, the reason I'm bringing up Yellowstone, though, is not to plug Kevin Costner's show. He doesn't probably need my advertisements. I think he might make a little bit more money than I do. But the reason that I'm bringing up Yellowstone is because there's this reoccurring theme in that show of like their valley, their ranch, as well as the broader Yellowstone Valley, as sort of a place that is worth fighting for, pushing for, sometimes driving yourself economically into the ground to stay attached to, right? Ranching even when it doesn't make financial sense, and sometimes not to spoil the storyline, but sometimes making some really shady moral decisions, really questionable decisions based on this idea of, but this is our place, right? This is the place that my great grandfather originally started ranching, and now I'm 4 generations in, and this is our place, and I'll do anything to keep this place. My point with that is place, right? Sense of place is a powerful thing. So back to this idea we were just talking about we don't live in, first and foremost, in spaces, we live in places. Edward Casey, as well as another philosopher by the name of Yi-Fu Tuan, as well as a lot of other people, have brought up this idea of space versus place. And I mentioned this the first week, but I want to get into it a little more now. Space is the land in a purely abstract physical sense. So for example, the Kenai River, I could describe it to you as, oh, it's 80 miles long. It descends about 400 feet in elevation. It drains a 2,100 foot square river drainage system. And, that's the Kenai River, and here's what the volume is, and so on and so forth. That's the land in a purely abstract geometric space, right? Purely the physical dimensions of it. Place is what all of that means to us. And it stands to reason then that that's one river, as one of my favorite theorists, Grader and Garkovich, point out, one river can actually be multiple rivers, right? It's physically one river, but it can mean very different things to different cultures that are using it. But anyways, there's space, the literal physical space, and then there's place, all the meanings that are around it that are intertwined with that. Now, how does space become place? Well, to some degree, it doesn't, right? To some degree, we're just born into place, right? I was born into Oregon, where we have all these ideas about what the Oregon landscape is. Many of you were born into Alaska, where you have all these ideas about what Alaska is, right? Last frontier, as they say. Although that's kind of debatable in a lot of ways. But anyways, we have all these things that we're just born into in our culture. Nonetheless, if we think long-term, not just of our own lives, but of our entire culture, at some point, cultures move into an area and take abstract space, a river, a mountain, and turn it into place, turn it into something meaningful. So how does that happen? Well, that process is what we call placemaking, how space is made into place by people. As Thornton puts it, a place is a framed space that is meaningful to a person or group over time. A related concept is the sense of place, that once we've gone through placemaking, once our culture or us individually have become sort of attached to specific meanings, we come to have sort of an overall idea of what that space is, an idea and also a set of feelings, how we sort of perceive the lands that we're on. And again, if you don't understand sense of place, you often don't understand why a group of people might be willing to give up economic opportunities, even give up their freedom and go to jail to protest, let's say, oil pipeline, or to protest a new mine, right? If you don't understand sense of place, you're going to really not understand certain things that happen in our world of environmental policy and environmental debates. I thought the reading brought up this pretty well, but I also want to refer to a couple of other things. There's another reading that I didn't have you do in this class, but I have some of my students in my religion class, as well as my Alaska Native Cultures class read. It's a really great one. It's by Nancy Furlow, who's Tlingit scholar, and it's called Angoon Remembers. And she talks about the village of Angoon, which we're going to get to in a minute, but she also talks about Tlingit country in general. And she says, the story of the Tlingit must begin with Raven. Raven created the Tlingit world, and the Raven stories tell us how Raven's cunning made our world what it is today, how he stole the sun, which many of you have heard that story, including perhaps in school if you grew up in Alaska, how he stole the sun, moon, and stars and brought light to the world, or how water dripping from his beak became our rivers and lakes, right? So this is an example of how you have this sort of geographic location, right? We could describe this in terms of, well, there's this many islands and archipelagos, and there's this amount of coastline and so on and so forth, and here's the precipitation it gets. It's very different to describe it as a place where water dripped from the beak of raven and made it into rivers and lake, right? A connection to something that happened during time immemorial, a connection to a sacred being, a sometimes morally complicated being, but a sacred being known as raven, right? That really changes from just pure geography into some kind of a landscape that means something to people. I mentioned already that with Australia and the Dreamtime stories that also in a similar way take it from a continent, which includes an outback and certain slightly more lush areas, and turns it into an area where even the smallest of rock outcropping can have a profound meaning. I mentioned before Two Women Sitting, which is a rock outcropping that is attached to a Dreamtime story of two women sitting down. I think it's actually two bandicoot women rather than two human women. But anyways, the rocks were destroyed by a mining operation. They took it to court and ended up getting damages for damaging a cultural site. Something that for the mining company wouldn't have been very much. I don't know if it was like 10,000 or 100,000, but the kind of money that's kind of a slap on the wrist for a mining company. But especially a slap on the wrist when you consider how the local tribe viewed it. The local tribe viewed it as a double homicide. This isn't damaging a piece of land, it's damaging two people that are literally sitting there, right? So sense of place, the way in which land becomes something much more than just what it can be physically measured as. A really good study of placemaking that I would recommend to any and all of you, it's not that long of a book, you could probably read it in a few days, and it's just so good, is a study done by Keith Basso called Wisdom Sits in Places. It's a book you should be able to easily find at bookstores or at Evil Amazon. There, I said crap about Jeff Bezos twice in this lecture. Anyways, just kidding, just kidding. Wisdom Sits in Places, that was an excellent book. Keith Basso, great anthropologist, had spent decades with Western Apache people in Arizona, specifically on the White Mountain Reservation, getting to know people, getting to know their jokes and their culture and their language, and doing all sorts of interesting studies. And then he wanted to do another study, and he asked his essentially friends in tribal government, like, hey, what should I do research on next? And they said, you should make a map of native place names. In fact, you should have already done this. We have lots of white people maps, but not like maps with our actual native names for things. You should have already done this, which I think is like such a funny comment. Hey, why didn't you do this before, dum-dum? But anyways, Keith Basso apparently took it in stride and wasn't offended and went and did the research. And as he did so and worked with a few elders to learn the place names, what he thought was just going to be developing a map with that was going to basically be like any other map, but just with native labels instead of Euro-American labels, turned out to be something much bigger, as he really got a deep dive into placemaking for Western Apache people. One of the things he found is that places and the names people attach to them weren't really just about identifying a place. They did a lot more than that. So there was names attached to lakes and ponds and stretches of grass and hills and things like that. But they weren't just ways of sort of making a map of, okay, I go here and then I take a right to get to my house. But the place names did a lot of things, right? As they often do in many cultures. The ways we talk about place, the ways that we think about places, the way that we call places, that does things socially. So for example, the place names were connected people to their ancestors. At one point, Keith Basso was mispronouncing a place name, and he says, oh, it's okay, whatever, I'll get it later. And one of the people he's working with, one of the Apache elders, says, it does matter. Tell him, he's saying this in Apache to the English-speaking Apache guy that they're working with. He says, tell Keith Basso that the way he's doing this is not right. You can't rush it. These are the words of the ancestors. Right. So one thing that place names did for Apache people was connected them to the ancestors, because their stories of, our people were wandering around, and they finally got to Apache country, and they thought they were going to die of dehydration, and they found this water and they drank from it, and they were so excited, and they started looking around and they started seeing all these great resources and places they could use. Right. So it connects you to that story of your ancestors. The place names also showed how the environment had changed since the times of the ancestors. So there's places like Snake's Water where there used to be a pond, and that's why it's called Snake Water, but now it's all dried up. And when people see that, they're like, wow, there's clearly been some change here over the past several generations, and then come up with theories about why that might be. The place names also are a way of recording stories. So they act as mnemonic devices. If you're familiar with that term, they act as reminders of stories that happened at these different places. So one place is called Shades of Shit. Excuse my swearing, but that's the name of it. And it is connected to a story. And the story is that there was an Apache group of people who were very stingy and didn't help out their relatives when their relatives' farm wasn't doing well. So then, even though they had all this corn, they wouldn't give it to their like cousins, basically. And so then their cousins come, or whatever relative it is, and traps them in their own home and says, hey, you think you can do so well on your own? Fine, you're stuck in there with all the corn that you got that you wouldn't share with anybody. And then they end up having to defecate in their own home. So thus, Shades of Shit. It's kind of a slightly humorous story, at least from an outsider's perspective, but one with a very serious message about generosity and cooperation. When you're in a somewhat unpredictable environment like Central Arizona, you can't afford to have people be stingy. You need people to cooperate in case one person's farm fails, and especially you need clans of people to cooperate. So Shades of Shit is a reminder of the importance of generosity. These place names also help people identify themselves, much like the Tlingit ones that we talked about. So there will be places like Juniper Tree Stands Alone, and then there'll be clans that are named after that, right? Juniper Tree Stands Alone people. And then finally, and kind of tying together a lot of this, these place names help remind people how to behave in a way that's right, according to that culture. There's a story, for example, that's attached to one of the places where it's all about a police officer that sided with an Apache police officer that sided with sort of the white police officers over his own people. And then people nowadays will say the name of that place to remind people of the story when somebody's acting kind of like a traitor to their own culture, when they're acting a little too, for lack of a better word, Euro-American and not enough like an Apache person. All right, so shifting away from the Western Apache, though, all of this brings up the way in which place and placemaking are connected with time. I'm not going to read this whole quote, but Thornton says, places reach across time, right? They bring forth the events of the past. They make them permanent through the enduring features of the land. I have seen this very much in my own work on placemaking, specifically with LDS historic sites. People can't literally hop in a time machine and go visit the earliest founders of their faith and have like join in the spiritual experiences they were having, but they can go to places that they knew were the same places that were back then. And people, when they do that, they oftentimes will like break down in tears, right? Or at least kind of have, a little bit of kind of a nice emotional experience as they feel connected to something from 200, 300 years previous. Places give us the ability to have something that far outlives the individual human lifespan. So you can feel connected to your ancestors, whether literal, as in the case of the Western Apache, or more in like, shall we say, cultural or spiritual ancestors in the case that I just shared. All of this to say, by the way, as a practical application, I mean, I think it's all been practical, but for a, I guess, career application, if you're going into land management, if you're going into something with Park Service, Forest Service, an environmental consulting firm, a CRM firm, as an applied archaeologist, whatever, if you want to understand what a place means to people, you really need to start with, or at least remember to think about stories, right? What stories do people tell? That often gives us profound layers of meaning to a place that might go far beyond just the way that people use space to make a living, right? That can be very important, how people fish in the area, for example, but that may just be one piece of a much bigger pie. Another example of space versus place and this idea of placemaking, this one's more sad, whereas the Western Apache one were kind of, a lot of those were kind of hopeful stories, or at least good reminder stories. The Angoon story is kind of sad, but also important as another example of placemaking and specifically applying that to the idea of trauma. So there's a community called Angoon. It's found on Admiralty Island. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And if you go to Wikipedia, it'll give you this incredibly exciting and illuminating paragraph. in my best boring Wikipedia voice. Rangoon is located on the west side of Admiralty Island at 572949 north, 1343425 west. It's the largest permanent settlement on Admiralty Island. It's sited on the isthmus at the mouth of Kutsanu Inlet and the west cove of the island. It's 60 miles southwest of Juneau. It's a total of 38.8 square miles, right? It's not perhaps uninteresting, but it doesn't exactly tell you a lot about what this place actually is for actual human beings. When you learn the history of Rangoon, you start to see what it means to actual human beings. For one thing, it's a village that's still lived in and been lived in for centuries and centuries and centuries. So there's a continuity with our ancestors, which is for Tlingit people, which is a beautiful, rich thing. It's also a place of collective trauma, as we sometimes refer to it, as a traumatic event that an entire people went through. Because this community of Rangoon, and this is a sad story, but an important story, back in the early days of the American whaling ships, right after the purchase of Alaska back in like the 1880s, a shaman, as we would say it in English, an Isht named Tlingit, he ended up dying in a whaling boat accident. It wasn't on purpose, but he did die while working for this American whaling company. So some Tlingit people, presumably his clan relatives, took a couple of boats hostage and said basically, well, take two small boats and two people that were with the two small boats hostage and said, hey, listen, boat or whaling company, you need to compensate us for the loss of Tlingit. You need to give us like 200 blankets, which is a really large amount of blankets, and blankets were basically treated as a form of wealth in Southeast Alaska at the time. That seemed like very strange behavior to the whaling ship. It makes a lot of sense within a Tlingit context, as Nancy Furlow points out. There traditionally was this idea of sort of balance and reciprocity, there still is, and the idea that funeral ceremonies are initiated by the opposite moiety oftentimes, and that it's done to kind of memorialize and honor the person who passed away in moiety A or clan A. And oftentimes involves potlatch, right? These ceremonies of generous gift giving. And to some degree, the Tlingit people, when they in Rangoon, when they lost Tlingit, were expecting similar behavior from the whaling company, that they would act like sort of another moiety, right? That they would act in an honorable way and do a grieving ceremony and a potlatch and a memorial for this man, which they didn't. Not only did they not do that, but they ended up viewing this as aggressive. And even after the Tlingit people returned the two hostages, they viewed this as an act of aggression, called in a U.S. Navy ship, and the U.S. Navy ship bombarded Rangoon with cannon fire. 6 children died. Many, I think the school building and some other buildings were razed to the ground, and people were caught stranded in the weather. A very, very sad time for Rangoon, and one that's still remembered to this day. As Nancy Furlow points out, people still talk about this event, 120, 130 years after the fact. So placemaking can be from stories and from beautiful memories of our ancestors, but placemaking also sometimes is a result of traumas that we've gone through, right? And the way those kind of embed ourselves in our cultures. But whether it's difficult memories or positive ones, I like kind of the way Thornton approaches placemaking. There's been a lot of different people that have talked about this idea of how do we make space into place? How does a place become meaningful to a culture? I've talked about it, but a million other people have talked about it as well. I'm certainly not unique in this way. Lots of people have written a lot of ink about how do we think about how does a river become so much more than just a river to people. I like the way that Thornton describes it in his chapter. He says we can think of it as having 4 aspects. There's the social organization, right? Things like tribes and clans, or nowadays we might say things like cities and villages, the way that people are placed around the landscape by virtue of their various memberships in different groups. There's the language, and as well as the conceptual structures, or we might more simply just put that as beliefs. So people's languages and their beliefs would shape how they think about the land. So there's how they're placed on the land. There's also how they think about the land as a result of their language, especially things like place names, which are sort of a constant reminder of a place and what that place means. It's notable that places oftentimes have some sort of connection to how the names that Native people in Tlingit country give to places, those names often have to do with either how the place is used or how ancestors interacted with that place or how it's connected to spiritual ceremony. Material production is another aspect of placemaking, the way in which we make a living on the land, right? There's a certain degree of placemaking that happens when you hunt the same land or berry gather on the same land for generation after generation. It comes to mean something, and you come to know that land very, very well. And then the ritual processes, the ways in which place then becomes part of things like a potlatch ceremony, things like a sacred crest. So that's an interesting model, and although it's kind of hard to remember, it might be worth taking notes on, because I think it's useful for those of us who might be looking at this in the future, whether you're working for a tourist agency and you're trying to make sure that you're respectful of local people's sense of place and that you represent it well, whether you're working for Forest Service and you're trying to make sure that the most recent forest management plan properly respects native sense of place, whether you are an environmentalist group who's trying to fight for not just native people but people in general's attachment to, let's say, the Kenai River, whatever it is, and you're trying to advocate for that at the policy level and agitate for better protections, whatever it is that you're doing with land management and with land protections, it's useful to think through what Thornton's talking about here. Think through how are they laid out on this land? How does this group of people, native, not native, multicultural, whatever the group is, how do they speak about this place? How do they use the place, right? Do they fish here? Do they gather here? Do they get mushrooms here? What's the connection on a physical level? And then how does it come up in their cultural ceremony and their sacred lives, their religious or spiritual lives? Those are 4 dimensions that you can always kind of start with as trying to understand what a place means to people so that you can respect what a place means to people. And I like on that note that he says, it's tempting for observers to overestimate the impacts of technological change. In other words, to think that Tlingit society has changed so much with modern industrial boats and smartphones and all of that, to think that the place just don't mean what they once did. And he points out that's really not the case. People are still very passionate about this. And he says and that's partly because of these different aspects of placemaking that are still ongoing with each new generation. Although people no longer have the same kind of Kwan village structure they once had, and a lot of the sort of clan ownership of specific spots has broken down, the overall idea of sort of we govern this land our own way is still very much there, as well as certain kinds of relations across clans. Even though a lot of people have switched to English and Tlingit is an endangered language, a lot of times the place names are still around and people use those as a way to connecting to these places. On a physical level, obviously subsistence looks a lot different than it did 300 years ago. People have motorized boats and, firearms and things. But as he points it out, the tech may be very different, but people still oftentimes live heavily on the land and use these resources. And then he points out, although a lot of Tlingit people have Christianized and converted to Christianity in the last 200 years, at the same time, there's a remarkable amount of continuity with pre-Christian Tlingit spiritual things, especially the potlatches, which have changed some, but are still there and are still sort of this, ironically enough, potlatches are memorials, but in a sense, they're also a memorial in the sense of they bring us back to a day before Christianity entered Alaska. So these things still on go, right? So space is still made into place, right? Tlingit land hasn't stopped meaning something to Tlingit people. And if we wanted to, this lecture is already too long, but we could think of a lot of other examples of place and placemaking and how practical of an effect these things really do have on the shape of our world and the shape of policy, and as well as how we respect human rights and cultural rights. Marisol de la Cadena wrote a great paper. It's kind of technical, but it's great. It's called Indigenous Cosmopolitics in the Andes, and she draws on some research both in Ecuador and Peru, in regions of the Andes Mountains with indigenous people, on how they understand various parts of the Andes Mountains. And she found some fascinating stuff. One of the things she found was about a place. Well, I'll just read the quote to you. Nazaria, which is this person she was speaking to, said that Azangate, which is a mountain that a lot of people go to for pilgrimage, both native pilgrimage and also Christian pilgrimage. Anyways, Azangate would not allow the mine in Sincara because there was a mine that people wanted to put in near the mountain, a mountain over which it presided. So Azangate is kind of like chief mountain over these like smaller mountains. It presides over them, right? we're thinking of place now not like some kind of abstract pile of rocks. These mountains are people. Azinguate would get mad and could even kill people. To prevent that killing, the mine should not happen. So Marisol, sees these local farmers and stuff protesting this new mine, and it's easy to think like, well, yeah, sure, nobody wants, especially in a part of the world where perhaps there's not as strong of environmental protections, and people aren't going to want to mine in their backyard that's potentially going to leach tailings and affect their farms and stuff. And sure, that's probably true, but it's interesting that that's not what Nazario says, right? This person that she interviewed said it's because the mountain will get angry and kill people. So a very different way of thinking of place that then informs the actions people take, such as actions to say, no, even if it would give us jobs in our community, we don't want that mine. This is a quote that you can read on your own time, but it's just a great quote. It doesn't really make another point that I haven't already made in the lecture. It's just a really beautiful quote where somebody talks about the idea, another Andean indigenous person talks about the idea of Pachamama, which has become very popular as a way of discussing traditional environmental beliefs. It essentially is like Earth Mother. And this person is saying, as a daughter, I hold responsibilities to preserve the well-being of Pachamama and all my other relatives, such as the Apus or mountains and lakes. To be able to continue with the legacy of my ancestors and preserve our seeds and well-being. It's interesting, by the way, that there's been efforts to try to work in what I'm going to call people places, right? Places that are considered to be people, to somehow work that into things. So for example, the Ecuadorian Constitution at one point, I don't know if it still does, but at one point, it added in a clause about Pachamama, about Mother Earth and the inherent rights that she has. And a lot of environmental protesters in Peru and things will bring up these idea of again, mountains as people, right? So these ideas are shaping policy and shaping activism in these areas, these ideas of places as people. You've also had in one part of Central America, and then also down in Maori country in New Zealand, what we call New Zealand, you've had a few different places where people have sought legal protections for rivers as people. So kind of by using the same sorts of laws that make corporations people, using that to kind of get rivers to have legal protections as people, which doesn't mean that they have full rights of sort of not being polluted, but it does mean that they'd sort of have indigenous groups that are they're sort of wards, if you want to think of it that way, of indigenous people. There's a certain amount of sort of rights that come about if we consider a river to be sort of a corporate person. It's kind of bizarre that we have to use the same sorts of laws that we use to make corporations people to try to protect rivers, which arguably are, at least for a lot of indigenous people, a lot more like people than than a corporation is. But the point is using existing legal mechanisms to recognize indigenous ideas of places as people. Moral of the story of all of this, sense of place doesn't magically disappear once people's cultures change, right? Just because colonizers have been in Ecuador and Peru for 500 years doesn't mean that people stopped caring about the mountains that they've always considered alive. That's continued now through dozens of generations, which is pretty freaking fascinating if you think about it. Sense of place, it turns out, is one of the most resilient and enduring things about a culture, one of perhaps the last things to change to some degree. You can see this also, for example, in the fight over Oak Flat. There's a video link you can go to if you'd like to. But basically it's a fight for a small patch of Arizona that's been the site of a proposed copper mine that Apache people have protested that, including by doing a super long sort of caravan across the country that went through Times Square and eventually into Washington, D.C., and they did a protest in Washington, D.C. A related concept, by the way, to placemaking that we've been talking about is the idea of cultural landscapes. And that's a concept that you should especially be familiar with if you're going to go into applied anthropology, land management, tourism management. I apologize for the typo here. That should just say cultural, not cultural. In fact, let me just fix that now, if the computer will let me. Thanks, computer. Anyways, the National Park Service defines cultural landscapes. In fact, I think it'll just pull up if I ask it nicely. It will not. That's okay. Anyways, the National Park Service has a website about cultural landscapes, and it defines cultural landscapes as, quote, a geographic area, including both cultural and natural resources and the wildlife or domestic animals therein, associated with a historical event, activity, or person, or exhibiting other cultural or aesthetic values. So National Park Service is in theory designed to protect some of the greatest natural wild places that we have from sort of aggressive development, um, which has its own complicated and sometimes kind of problematic history that we could get into another time, including sometimes dispossessing indigenous people. But in the last couple of decades, Park Service has made a really deliberate effort to try to recognize native attachments to place and to include that as part of the story they tell, because that's a big part of what a park is, a national park. If you've ever been to national parks, it's a big part of what they do is essentially through the signs, through the visitor center, through the rangers, try to tell a story about what this place is. And so there's been much more of an effort in the last few decades to acknowledge these places as indigenous cultural landscapes, or sometimes not always even indigenous cultural landscapes. I have a grad student who worked in Mammoth Caves down in Kentucky and was looking at sort of attachments of the local African American community who had long worked in that area for about 100 years. So anyways, in this like cave complex in the area where people did spelunking or cave exploration. So cultural landscapes, though, Park Service is trying to recognize and acknowledge that people have these kind of long-standing cultural attachments to places. And that's great because that's also sort of what we as scholars recognize is that it's not just specific sacred places, as we sometimes speak about it, like, oh, this specific sacred site, but we might more generally think of it as like large stretches of land that have meanings to people, cultural meanings, within which you might have certain sacred sites or sites of ceremony, but kind of these broader ideas of meaningful landscapes. And I liked in that regard the quote from Thornton where he says, tourists tend to marvel when they go to places like, Glacier Park. They tend to marvel in weir-like mystical terms at the fabulous peaks, glaciers, fjords, and other physical features of grandeur. So much of traditional Tlingit territory is now owned by the federal government. And so tourists come to it and they see it as like, oh my gosh, the fjords, oh my gosh, the mountains. But as Tom Thornton points out, Tlingits, at least in their own locales, are more likely to perceive and characterize places in terms of the practical activities, i.e., it's a good fishing hole, it's egg gathering country, people like gather gull eggs, it's dangerous rapids, or in terms of their social geography, i.e., that's Coho clan country, or that's where Raven made his swing. We see this with other groups too, like Kwakwaka, a little bit further south, will name, there's a specific place in their territory where it's like two rock outcroppings. And so if you were just like, name that based on what you look like, you would call it like rock outcroppings, but instead Kwakwa people name it as the place where you harpoon seals, because that's traditionally a place where you harpoon seals. So these landscapes have meanings attached to how people have always used them and always taught about them. All right. So I think this is probably a good place to pause the lecture. So I'm going to pause the lecture here. Thank you. Close.